Good morning and welcome to our September BMI dialogue, our very first dialogue titled Expanding Black Male Pipelines to Academics, Career, and Professional Development. I am Dr. Mahaliel Bethea, Director of My Brother's Keeper grant-funded programs at the New York City Department of Education, and I have the privilege and pleasure to be joined by three dynamic men of distinction for this important conversation. Brothers, I look forward to spending our time discussing and learning from our collective understandings around the concept of pipeline work in general and its direct impact on shifting the academic, college, and career narratives for our boys and young men of color. So before we get started with the questions, let's do introductions. All participants are asked to state their name, organization, and any Twitter or social media handle information they want to provide. We'll start with Mr. Banjo.
Grace and peace. My name is Rashaun Banjo. I am the program director for Team Crate, a nonprofit organization based in Southside Queens. I'm also the CEO and president of Prolific Consulting Services, a youth leadership development corporation. I can be reached at prolificconsultingservices.com. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is Andrew Bennett. For people to call me Drew. I am the director of student life at Guttman Community College. I've done a lot of work with BMI in previous roles, but right now mentoring and student life is my main focus in my new current role. I guess social media wise, just follow our school at Guttman CC to stay in touch, or you could follow up with JR if you want to get in contact with me. Dr. Bethea.
Good morning, brothers. I am Donald Ruff. I'm the president and CEO of the Eagle Academy Foundation. From a social media standpoint, you can catch me on LinkedIn, or you can follow us at the Eagle Academy Foundation on Instagram.
Thank you, gentlemen. And make sure that we follow, for all of those watching, let's make sure we follow the gentlemen on social media and follow the amazing work that each of their organizations are committed to. And so we're going to get right into the questions. And so, gentlemen, we hear this term pipeline constantly being used in conversations around support for Black and brown boys and young men. Can you actually describe what that is? So what is an academic to college and career pipeline? What does it look like? Let's start there.
Well, I guess I'll start off. So when I seen the question, the first thing that resonated to me was that, pipeline kind of has a visual aspect of connecting one to another, right? So let's first define what pipeline is in a visual in an aspect. In the context of this conversation, we're looking at frameworks of networks that young men of color have to produce positive experience at higher education. I think that's the kind of correlation of what we're talking about as an ethos. So what does that look like? How does that feel? How do those students experience that? I think that's the deeper question. But first, we have to define like pipeline. And for me, that's a framework for which young men of color have a visual, sensory, and understanding of confidence that they can attain a higher education experience.
Any other thoughts on the pipeline definition or terminology? Because I agree with you. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what we say every time we say pipeline in this conversation. So any additional thoughts?
Yeah. Funny, the word pipeline kind of has a negative connotation for me. Usually in these contexts, we talk about the prison pipeline a lot. So I'm glad we're able to kind of reframe that word. But I think about my journey and how I've gotten here was through a pipeline. A mentor of mine, Dr. Kenneth Thurgens, made sure that, folks who are interested in higher education, he kind of gave them those opportunities to go right from college into grad school, many from which then continue to get their PhD. So that's mentorship right there. That's representation, which is huge, and just seeing yourself in these spaces where, Black and brown young men aren't represented. So having folks in those positions, you see yourself represented in those positions, they're able to then kind of turn back and bring people along. And just even yesterday, I Googled the word Sankofa. Random reason, we won't get into that, but the word Sankofa is a Ghanaian word, which means, and I might butcher it, but essentially it means kind of looking back to bring forward as well. So that's really what it's about. Just making those bridges and connections, and like my brother Banjo said, just getting folks into new positions.
Right.
Thank you for that. Other thoughts around pipelines? What is it? What does it look like? What does it feel like?
You know, it's interesting, right? I agree with both of those definitions, and but also pipeline can be problematic, right? It's what it should be and what it is not, right? It's pipeline in theory, right? But it's also one of those things that I feel, you know, to define it has like a million different definitions depending on who you have a conversation with, right? But ideally, it's really the triangulation of services, supports to get one from point A to their ultimate destination, which hopefully will be the manifestation of their greatest potential, right? So that's kind of how I really look at, like, you know, what a pipeline should be aspirationally.
I love that. And for the purpose of this conversation, we're going to speak in the framework of what it should be, right? Because we have 3 organizations on the call that are contributing to these types of pipelines. And we want to make sure that, yes, I agree in terms of what pipelines can be, what people claim it to be, but it's not. We all know what happens sometimes when you pull back the curtain on some of these pipeline programs, right? But I think for the purpose of our conversation, our viewers want to hear about what is an optimal or a high level, high functioning pipeline look like. And I love what you said, Mr. Ruff, around the triangulation of several things, right? And so we're actually going to get into that piece right now. And so the way I want to shift it is really talking about the significance, like what's possible. Mr. Bennett spoke to kind of his own experience in connection to a pipeline. But the question I want to pose to the group is, like, why are these pipelines necessary or significant? And what role have they played in your life?
I believe they're necessary to give one a blueprint, a roadmap, navigation, right? In terms of identifying what they're looking to do in life from a career standpoint. For me, I've been a beneficiary of some incredible blessings just throughout my lifetime, right? From my education, from the opportunities that I've had, what has been poured into me. And when I think about a pipeline, my pipeline, just starting from the women that raised me, was education as being that great equalizer, right? So being on this path of, you know, going to school and getting a good job, right? I come from that generation. And in that, it was really working hard academically, being selected for a scholarship program in high school, which really changed my life. I'm an alum of the Oliver program, right? Which is similar to Better Chance in Prep for Prep, where they take high achieving, low income minority students out of public junior high schools and place them into private schools with full ride scholarships. And it was that experience that gave me 2 realizations. One, I didn't know I was poor until I went to private school. That was the first, thing. The second thing was, it was when I first noticed the inequalities in education, right? I went from a classroom of 30 kids in my public junior high school to classrooms with 12 to 15 students, right? But then also a plethora of opportunities that were really available to me. And with my scholarship program pouring into me this professional skills development, knowing how to interview, right? Office skills, like we had courses where we had to type 60 words a minute or you couldn't get out of the class. If I'm being honest, the networking, the interviewing skills, how to conduct a job search, those office skills, that skill set is something that I've used throughout my life, right? But these were foundational things that they gave me as a rising 9th grader. So when you talk about pipelines, it's about the preparation that one receives in order for them to maximize their future and maximize opportunities. And so I think education for me has been that, from Brooklyn Friends to Oberlin College, right? And so forth and so on. That has been my, my pipeline, if you will, into my career.
If I could expand upon that point that Brother Ruff just shared, I definitely think that I heard a number of different areas that I definitely think that we can connect. A lot of what we strive to do in the last, I would say, 7 years now with my brother's keeper work, and specifically the work that I've done in North Queens, was about building out pipelines to opportunity, right? A lot of what you expressed, Brother Ruff, is about the experiences and learned experiences that were given to you or provided to you through a series of events, right? And what we wanted to kind of premise in part of the MBK Fellows group, and I know my brother Mahaliel can speak to this, but most specifically in our high schools was about leadership and the opportunities that exist. So a pipeline kind of seems narrow. That's why my brother Drew Steve had a negative connotation. I know I was raised with a negative view of a pipeline. I too came from a pipeline that was more related to basketball, which provided me the same private school experience. But what we find is that pipelines are very narrow. And if we provide our kids with the pipelines to opportunities, we provide them with pipelines to experiences, then the learning that comes authentically through that impacts both the instructional person and the character person that we're building alongside of it. So I want us to also make sure that we're not thinking of a narrow view of success, because my brother, I did prep for prep too. There's a narrow view of success there, right?
Absolutely.
We don't all get the same opportunity
Right.
for Jack and Jill and prep for prep, right? Don't get me wrong. Those are great pipelines,
Right.
but they're very narrow. So the
Very.
pipelines that I want to be a part of are broad. They exist in looking at college preparation. They look at mentorship. They look at internship, because those are things that, to me, characteristically build out success for our Black and brown students.
Yes. Definitely have to echo the broadening, right, of the pipeline, right? Sometimes I think the pipeline is like a straw, right, versus a tunnel. And I think it's really about positioning young people with the access and understanding of all of the pathways that exist for one to be positioned to be successful in life, right? Not just this college or bust, right? But how are all things spoken about equally, whether it's going to the trades, whether it's going to the military, right? Whatever it is, right? Giving young people the information, the access, the opportunity, and the preparation to define success on their own terms, right? And brother, we got to talk offline about the Prep for Prep Oliver thing, because it's something that honestly, I just went back to my high school reunion for the first time in 31 years, right? And so much of that was like, right now, they just found language for what we were probably navigating back then in terms of the microaggressions, right? The stereotype threat, imposter syndrome. Those weren't terms back then, right? But we were the guinea pigs going through that process. And I think it's actually that experience that fueled me in my youth development work in general, right? Wanted to just create greater access, not just from a college pathway, but what are all of the pathways that exist?
Absolutely. I mean, we're given such a narrow view of success, right? We have a pipeline to say that, athletics and music or entertainment are the real pipelines. Our youth still, we can really have an educated discussion about this, but I was just with some teenagers last night that still think that music, entertainment, and sports are the best pipelines for them to get out of the what they see as every day. So I think, as much as we keep talking about pipelines and connections to success, we have to make sure that success itself is broadened to the fact that young people can see themselves emulating some of these ideals that you talk about, the trades, the STEM opportunities that's coming up. I know that this is a faux pas, but the cannabis industry has come introduced into New York State. How are our youth being adequately engaged into walking into that industry, not just from a consumption standpoint? Because again, that's an ideal that we're fed that only Black people consume, right? But we should be welcome into an industry. So I just think the education around success should be a more broader conversation. And I definitely want to be a part of that.
And that comes down to exposure, brother. That's what you're nailing, right? It's about exposing them to all the ways one can be successful in seeing Black and brown faces in those places and spaces, because that's what's missing. That's why we continue to pigeonhole ourselves into these very narrow pathways, if you will.
That's why I let off representation, because I think about just my journey growing up. I didn't know, if I heard somebody was a doctor or they had a doctorate, I thought they were performing surgery. I didn't realize you get your doctorate until I got to college. I was like, oh, like, it's more than just like, operation table, you know what I mean?
Right.
So like this, seeing people that look like me do that, it just opened up a world of opportunity and things different than what we knew growing up. And like my brother was saying, I grew up in the same thing. Go to school, get a job. You know what I mean? My parents are first generation Caribbean. Like, you know, I didn't have opportunities like the new generation has now. You know what I mean? They get on YouTube and they're just seeing a world of opportunities, but it's about that exposure. So when I do like career panels and I bring people on, nothing wrong with being a doctor, lawyer, teacher, right? But again, that's what we're taught from the day we were born, at least in my, where I was brought up.
Yeah.
So I do try to be intentional about bringing folks in different careers, and it's like, you can do that too. You know what I mean? Like, you don't have to, you know, kind of fit in the pigeonhole of what society says we got to do. So I think representation is a huge thing. And like you said, exposing a different field, different opportunities. So just piggybacking on everything you all just said.
I really appreciate that. And as I'm listening to everyone, two words are just ringing: access and opportunity, right? And I'm thinking about programs like My Brother's Keeper, like New York City Men's Teach, like, you know, Black Male Initiative, like the Eagle Foundation, and various CBOs all over the city that are providing these. And so I actually want to shift into that. And I want to speak a little bit or talk directly from the viewpoint of each of the organizations that you represent on the call today. And if you could, tell us how your organization creates, establishes, contributes to these pipelines or to these concepts and understandings around access and opportunity. How do you make sure that the individuals that you have the opportunity to serve get those experiences, have access to these types of programs that as y'all have spoken to, are life-changing?
You know, I think being in New York, we are so blessed with abundance when it comes to, like, you know, high quality programs. From an Eagle Academy Foundation standpoint, as I look at our work, you know, I think initially at our founding, everything was really focused on high school graduation and getting young men into college, right? You know, back in 2003, graduation rate was at like 32%. It was a crisis, right? And so, but as we've grown and as we evolved, and now we have 2,600 young men who've graduated from Eagle Academies, as we engage with our alumni in conversations, we need to be more. We need to do more. And what we've learned is that the ecosystem for Black and brown boys to be successful does not exist, right? Because the industry doesn't speak to higher ed doesn't speak to secondary schools, and community-based organizations are all trying to fulfill their own individual, right, mission statements. So there's a need for us to triangulate these entities for the activation, preparation, and success for Black and brown boys. And so when we talk about access and opportunity, I think one of the most incredible things that we've done as a foundation is really take full advantage of this embarrassment of riches that New York City has to offer, right? And really bringing those programs across our network of schools. We love to collaborate, right? And we also know that young men of color are underrepresented in so many programs across the city. And so being able to bring in, like, you know, over $2 million in in-kind support, partnering with, you name it, whether it's MBK, whether it's Fordham Step, whether it's SEO, and seizing every opportunity, basically having a diverse, like, you know, menu of programmatic offerings that speak to our entire population, not just the highest achieving, right? But those who guys are in the middle, those guys at the bottom third of the class, making sure that there's options for everyone and being able to take full advantage of everything that New York City has to offer, and really believing in partnerships and understanding that we can't do it all, right? In our individual schools to meet the needs for all of our students. How do we leverage partnerships to really broaden, right, the opportunities that are available and actually widen the pipeline for success?
Yeah.
To add, okay. Oh, I was going to add on to Brother Ruff. He really talked about building an ecosystem, and I think that's really what my work for the past 5 years in developing and working with the Team Create Fall Rock Strong organization has been about. Since its inception, MBK has sort of been what we've kind of grown as I really focus youth development for Black male success and opportunities in DOE. And to your point, we have such a plethora of great programs that already exist in our city. So why not just emulate? So basically what I did was take, Eagles principles and the models that we developed with My Brother's Keeper and really impacted my home county of Far Rockaway, Queens, where our goal was to kind of build youth engagement and build up some of the programming deficits that we saw. What we see now is services that include over 150 youth from up and down the peninsula. We have athletic programming, we have mentoring programming, we do reading clubs. So going back to your point about building an ecosystem, I think it was really pointed to me to step at this space now because I realized the work doesn't just exist within the Department of Education. It doesn't just exist in schools. We have to have partnerships that serve the whole student, but also the whole community in which the student resides in. So that's where my organization comes in, Team Create Far Rock Strong. And I think that's where we kind of make that next connection around creating the ecosystem. Thank you.
I add on my 2 cents. The 3 things I wrote down was one, it's not a one size fit all approach. Understanding that, whether you could be, identity makes a big difference, you know what I mean? So we have, depending on whatever identity you're going to talk about, sexual orientation, being West Indian, being American, being, high achieving, low achieving, like it's not a one size fit all approach. You know what I mean? I think we have to not go in with a blanket approach and working with our students. And I think you all kind of spoke about that. So being able to be flexible, being able to have something for everybody, I think is very important. Which also goes back to the next thing I wrote down is thinking about the holistic student. And one of my favorite quotes, something that I live by, or at least one of my approaches to working with students is, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And we can have all the resources available, but if you're not being able to foster those relationships with students, mentorship, building those relationships, they're not going to come back. You can have all the services in the world, but if they're not coming in the door or you're not retaining them, that's not going to work. So I think I try to lead with relationship building and having a solid mentor group, peer leaders, et cetera, that kind of are welcoming and will get our young men in the door and to stay in the door. And lastly, I wrote down collaboration, which is something that we've all been saying. We may not have all the resources ourselves, but it's important to reach out to different organizations, partnerships, different organizations, like as I mentioned, just to, in case we're missing something, we could lean on another partner organization to kind of help fill in the void. So you all kind of elaborated on that, but those are the 3 things I wrote down.
Now, I really appreciate how you lifted a few things. One, this resource conversation. And actually, I want to spend a little bit of time actually going into that and hearing from you brothers about what needs to be true around resources. Whenever I used to hear people say resources, I always knew that was code word for money, right? But as we well know, like, Brother Bennett already brought this up, you can have all the money, but if you don't have certain other resources in play, that money could be wasted. And I don't think I need to tell anybody on this call, about times in which large organizations have wasted a lot of money because they missed this point. And so I'm interested to hear from y'all about the resource piece. So let's put the money aside. If there are folks on this call that are like, I'm looking to contribute to pipeline work, I'm looking to, like, what are the resources that need to be in play specifically for our Black and brown young men and men of color? Like, what do we need? What's left? What's still outstanding? And what do we need to maintain as it relates to our resources? That could be time, that can be people, that can be things that money can buy. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I'll start off. I think from my experience working in retention, working with our Black and brown males, the number one thing that we've yet to be able to do at my school in particular is have somebody full-time. And if you have part-time work, you get part-time results. And when I was kind of in the role, I was wearing a lot of hats in my full-time job, and they also not asking me to do this on the side. And it's like, I still got a person I'm trying to leave at a certain time. It's like burnout, you know what I mean? And so staffing is huge. And then adequate staffing so people aren't burnt out and are able to do the work. Because as much as we say 9 to 5, our students are in the office till 8, 9 o'clock at night, you know what I mean? And like, if you're not adequately staffed, burnout is gonna happen and things aren't gonna get done. So like I said, part-time work is gonna get part-time results. And then the second thing is assessment is huge. And not everybody in this role can necessarily do assessment. I know that's not necessarily my favorite thing to do. Everybody who knows me knows that's not my favorite thing to do, but I know how important it is. And, you know, you have to make data-driven decisions. And whether that's having somebody on staff that could do that, or just being more intentional about it, but it needs to be something that's on the forefront. And as much as I'm the co-curricular, you know, program guy, I do know that assessment is extremely important, so you can like, analyze what you're doing and make data-driven decisions. So those are the two things I think on when it comes to resources.
So taking off of operations hat, I think you know, everything resources resolves around money, especially when we're in a capitalist society. So we all talk about money. But I wanted to backtrack a little bit about the data. One thing that I think that has been really prevalent, thing that we have to work on, is how we kind of track progress. Right now, we have goal markers that are somewhat broad. Attendance, graduation rates. For higher education, it might be matriculation and recruitment, right? But we need to have measures that track and monitor the growth of students in a different way. And I don't know, this is why we're, you know, having a conversation amongst, you know, great minds, but we have to track incremental data that speaks to students' growth that may not be tracked with test scores and proper assessments. And that can be relative data, that could be anecdotal data, that could be, you know, student testimonials. I don't really know, but I do know that as we see students progress, specifically as we looked at our chapters and My Brother's Keeper and student leadership, there was growth that was unable to be captured through the metrics that the state looked at, which ultimately designates funds. So we may need to, I know the DOE is really actively creating tracking mechanisms so that we understand how we get students from from high school to college, and how do we continue to support them in higher education. But I also think that we have to look at how we're looking at assessing students' growth directly related to social emotional learning and this impact that we want to have, because that's going to speak to how we're able to continue to fund this and able to get more dollars.
Agreed. Actually, let's talk about that. Let's talk about, I mean, there are metrics that each of your organizations may currently be using, right, that may or may not be lined up with what we would all know to be kind of the traditional funding metrics, which Brother Banjo brought up, right, kind of attendance and like percentage, insert percentages here, right, of graduation rate, retention, persistence, et cetera. But so I'm interested to know, like, how are you currently, what are your official and unofficial markers for success currently? And if there are things you feel should be measured, but you aren't measuring yet, like, let's name those also, right? Just as a way to kind of figure out how organizations such as yourselves or people thinking about this type of work, how should we be identifying success or naming success?
You know, Ruff.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in here, and because you guys, man, you said so many things in response to that last question, and I was just really just taking notes. And, you know, to your point, Dr. Bethea, right? I was thinking about this, and we have to be better organized as CBOs, right? To redefine what success is for the young people that we serve. We are our own greatest resource. We all in the windows have a lived experience that we all know well, but we've been in this position where people who don't necessarily have the experience is telling us what success should or should not be. And I know what I'm saying is really bold and audacious, but I think we have to become better organized to redefine the lens and the measures of what success is for the young people that we serve, and really shattering this straw-like pipeline and creating this tunnel of what success could be, right? So when we think about these measures, right, and you know, you're mentioning resources, and I look at resources in terms of people, right, programs, right, even going beyond money, how are we leveraging each other in terms of the sharing of best practices, our storytelling, right? How are we getting ourselves out there? But, you know, we have our standard measures of like high school completion, college enrollment, college persistence. But I think where we have to stretch ourselves, it's about who our young people become as a result of our intervention, right? So, you know, Brother Banjo mentioned the whole social emotional growth and development. We have to start measuring that and showing the impact of that, because the suicide rate right now for Black adolescents is insane. I saw some number from like 1996 to I think it was 2019. It has increased over 70%, right? Us measuring that puts us in a better position to show the value of our work, right? And I think in the CBO space, we're in a very unique position because, see, systemic change is going to take time with the educational system. We are the ones that can be a little bit more flexible and actually start to change the narrative and start to change the measures. Another piece that, you know, as we were working on this report was how we engage with our alumni. As we started to track how many alumni we've connected with employment, right? How many folks we've helped re-enroll in college, connect them to helpful resource, review resumes. That's not something that any of our funders are asking for, but it's something that we absolutely have to measure, because what it speaks to is that lack of an ecosystem and how we're slowly starting to build out that ecosystem to support our young men post high school graduation, right? So those are just a few things that I really think about, but I think we as community-based organizations, we have to work more collaboratively to redefine what success is for the populations that we serve.
I totally agree. I just wanted to give you that. I totally agree.
Yeah, it's, I don't say triggering, but it's interesting because as I try to, you know, I've been working in peer mentoring for a long time, and a lot of what we do is that, you know, social emotional development, you know, and how do you really assess that? You know, you see the student come in, you know, head down, low confidence, not speaking up. Well, by the time they leave, they're public speaking, they're applying a job, they're applying an internship, they got a firm handshake. You know, it's just like we see the development change, but outside of, you know, even when you do pre and post assessment, a lot of that is, you know, based on the individual, and it's very anecdotal, and I found it hard to like hold valid in certain spaces. So I would like to hear some advice on how you are able to validate, you know, some of the things that we see as staff members, as mentors, and yeah. So how do you hold that valid?
So one thing that we do at our organization is we use a lot of the students' voice. And right now, students' voice right now is increasingly social media. It's almost sickening, but it works. And and really, to speak to some of like the anecdotal representation, data collection, that's really where it lives. We have testimonials, we have pictures, we have experiences that we videotape, like our book, our reading club. That is actual data, right? It's not looked at in the sense of the instructional sense that we have when we come look at the metrics that are painted before us, but that is data. And when you start to get parents that come to you and tell you about the impact that you've had over their children, that you've helped get into high school, and now they're still part of the organization in some way or form, that's data, right? I mean, for us, we utilize that voice to speak to politicians, and that, you know, increases the level of funding. But the same idea, the same metric can be used for our institutions, right? Our you know, one thing that we did push while I was with the city and BK is documenting everything, right? Because we have to show these students from where they start with us in engagement and then when they end, because it's a much different picture, right? And when they do have a voice and they're able to present themselves, that is data. Now, how we have to capture that for our respective metrics, we can get really flexible. But when you start to see these young men and these young ladies now that I'm tasked with, and you see their growth and you see the development, the next level is mentorship. Like my brother Ruff said, those alumni, how many Eagle graduates are now teachers or mentors? And that should be the ecosystem that we're building, because the power stays with us, you know,
Right.
and if we create that, you know, it's almost like the field of dreams, they will come.
And to that point, you both kind of just brought up this question, and I love what you said, Brother Banjo. We've been playing around with this tool, and the funder actually put us onto it. It's called Hello Insight. And Hello Insight is actually a tool that measures social emotional learning, career readiness, college readiness, as well as like youth leadership in action. And it kind of speaks to self-advocacy and everything else. So we've kind of found that tool to be very helpful in us starting to measure this and being able to speak that language in terms of the growth with real data, right? So hello, Insight. The second one, Insight, yes. And so that's been incredibly helpful to us as a measurement tool and starting to shift our language in terms of how we really tell our student stories, right? But it's now about, like, not just in the 6 to 12 space, but also how do we do a better job of telling this alumni story and who our young men become? Because you're right, we have Eagle guys who are now fathers, right, themselves, who are now educators within our school system, deans of student life. We have guys who are now helping us create this ecosystem by providing their younger Eagle brothers with job opportunities. So I truly believe that we are our own greatest resource, but I think how we come together as organizations, we can actually slowly but surely create an incredible ecosystem where all of our young men are winning.
And to that point, I just wanted to note and give credit to CUNY. We've had several successful events around Queens, around the city, that has highlighted some of the youth development that's been in that specific area. Some of my earliest memories of 2019, when we were in Queens College, where we had several hundred students, Eagle Queens as well, participate and just show the development that they were learning, and show the activities that they were engaged in that really made them feel more part of the school experience. We then followed that up with a professional development series at York College, where we invited administrators, we invited teachers to come in and actually see some of the work that their students were leading and how that they can incorporate some of those same activities into the instructional practice to create those better relationships. So I think that's a great opportunity for, continue that now that we're kind of coming out of COVID, everybody has their shots, that maybe we get back in space. And that visual aspect, I didn't realize how important that was. That is really important because young men and older men, right, get to convene and see a space of combined kind of advancement towards a common goal, which is an ultimate success for us all, right? But when you go upstate and you start to see the symposium, and I think we have to build some of that ecosystem here. That's an example of success. That's the example of the work that we're currently doing. And so I'm looking forward to filling up the calendars. I know Brother Bethea has a number of events that we'll be doing, but that's actual progress. That's actual learning, and we have to evidence that and show that as well.
I love that. And I think the last thing, one of the things I would add, not the last thing, I think our organizations are just on the cusp of understanding the importance of formal research around these items, right? And I think for a long time, we've told the story, but that story's almost sometimes been has been confronted by like very formal research studies when we have the capacity and ability to engage in these studies ourselves, right? And so we know the quantitative and the qualitative studies that can take place, and we're starting to now see, as research is coming out, people are starting to be like, oh wait, hold up, that's I didn't know that, like that wasn't available, that information wasn't available to us 10, 15 years ago. And so I think that there is a collective power in us, in organizations that are working to support boys and young men of color, to really figure out, well, what are the markers that they aren't looking at, and how do we formalize that research to make sure that that not only are we saying these things are important, but we have the data and evidence to back it up, right? And so just a thought.
No, and you know what, to that point, how do we create that marriage and that collaboration between researchers and CBOs, the folks on the ground doing the actual work? There's always a fundamental disconnect and a fundamental rub, right? We're at a place right now in our human history, we can't be battling with each other, right? So how do we start to bring researchers, Black and brown researchers, into our fold, where what they are learning, they're bringing to us, and we're able to apply it in terms of our action? It shouldn't be disjointed. Like, we have to really figure out how do we come together in this sense for the betterment of our entire community, like, and not just in New York City, but across this country. But I haven't really seen that type of collaboration happen yet, right? And don't get me wrong, my head is in the ground with this Eagle work, so it might be happening somewhere in the world, right? But that's something I would love to see even here in New York City, if we can actually blaze the trail in that regard, I think that would be incredible.
We
Yeah,
got
I think I think it's definitely ownership. You know, we have to be part of the ownership that creates the metrics in which we are supposed to be graded under, right? You know, in many cases, I don't think, you know, when we start to look at formal education, how Black and brown children are educated was part of that metric. I don't think so, because there are some nuances, right? There are some nuances. So I think being part of the room and being part of the policy making that makes the metrics is part of how we tend to systemically change the tide, stem the tide.
That's most certainly appreciated and heard. And I think, you know, as we talked about a lot, right, in this short amount of time as it relates to kind of like how these pipelines have the opportunity or the potential to really shift narratives for our boys and young men of color. We've spoken a little bit about how each of your organizations have contributed to these types of, to the concept, right, or to pipelines in general, or frankly have even created your own pipelines. And just this importance of access, opportunity, and really being strategic. What I'm hearing is like this, like, how do we get what we would, many of us would call this siloed work, right? How do we get connected, right, with the right folks to do the right work at the right time for the right people, right? And so that's all going to be important to us. And so just as we wrap up, I think the final question there's so much stuff to talk about, but the last question I just want to leave y'all with is, I want you to speak directly to the current work, right, that each of your organizations is engaged in. And I want you to just talk to our viewers about how your population is better off because you were here and you are here. And so that's the final question. How are your populations better off as a result of the work and your contributions to the pipeline and shifting the narrative?
That's a big question, but I'll start with the work that we currently engage in. So I'm working with some CBOs, most notably Rockaway Redevelopment Revitalization Corporation, which is a nonprofit specifically aimed at improving the economic and social impacts on Far Rockaway, Southeast Queens specifically. So I'll be doing some leadership development work with them. I'll also be working with some Long Island districts and shaping out some of their youth leadership work. One thing that we didn't realize at the pandemic is that when we lost a lot of kids from New York City, that they didn't just all go, you know, to Florida. Some of them went to New Jersey, Long Island, and Connecticut. And so there's a lot of school districts that are actually dealing with students that they didn't really have before. And now they're creating programs similar to what we like to have and see impacted in New York City. But frankly, I don't know what my impact is. You know, I'm kind of like my brother, Mr. Ruff, you know, I'm taking it one day at a time, task at task, in the weeds. One thing I do know is that the legacy that I want to leave is that one of which that each young person or each person I come across and touch, I not only inspire, but I give them a framework to better themselves and find success. Because I think I start from an aspect of all of our young people have success within them, and that we have to give them the blueprint for them to find it. So I hope that that's part of my lasting legacy and part of my impact that I leave. Thanks.
Question. Definitely a question to answer. I wasn't expecting that one, but I think that in my role, how I feel like I've been able to impact students. And the one word that as I'm like writing down my notes and thinking out loud, I would think is opportunity. I pride myself on just being able to give students opportunities to grow, to connect, to network. I definitely hold my students to a high standard and regard. So as I'm collaborating with different partners and again creating these opportunities and bringing folks in the room to network, you know, making sure that they apply to these programs, and even when they say I don't think I could get it, you know, sitting with them for hours on their resumes and interview prep, and like this is really believing in students. I feel like this believing in other folks and my young adults has helped them to see more than themselves and themselves. Does that make sense? And I think what I hear a lot is when my students reach back out is like, nobody believes in me but you, you know, like I wouldn't have even applied to this position if it wasn't for you. Like, you know, that recommendation you wrote me just you're the one that told me to do X, Y, and Z, you know, so that bridge and that pipeline, I guess, right? I definitely could view myself as a pipeline in a lot of ways. So I think that's what it is. It's providing opportunity and believing in our young adults.
Yes. I'm going to piggyback off of that, right? I think as I look at our Eagle work, right, now that we're in like 6 schools, creating places and spaces where, you know, while our schools work to close the achievement gap, as a foundation, we work to close the access and opportunity gaps, but it's also creating this space where they're loved, right? They're loved and we believe in them until they can believe in themselves. And that's just so rare in that 6th through 12th journey and how we continue to be there for them. You know, I think at our founding, it was really about, you know, trying to impact the high school dropout rate and shattering that prison pipeline, right? But I think the most important part of our work is to continually evolve, right? I believe that evolution is the revolution, and we have to be constantly responsive to what's happening in this day and time and the needs for our students, and learn from our work, right? Learn from our successes, also learn from our failures, right? And figuring out how we can be better, right? And right now I feel that we're in a place where this time of like just adults telling kids what to do is over. We have to work in youth adult partnership, right? Because our experience is not their experience, right? I had to go to the library and research stuff. I couldn't Google everything. Internet wasn't popping when I was coming up, right? There are career fields that are available now that weren't available back then. So I think we have to continue to evolve. And I think our young people are better off, like, you know, for us being around to provide a place where they can be loved, but also a place that's not just looking at them in a moment in time, but really, how do we not just graduate students, right? But how do we activate futures? And I think that's what the work is really about.
Woo, all right. Brothers, I mean, I honestly don't believe there's a better way to end that. I'm just so thankful for your contributions to today's discussion. Rashaun, Banjo, Andrew, Bennett, and Donald Ruff, 3 stewards in the work, contributing to shifting the narrative from this prison pipeline to this pipeline of success. Brothers, I'm for one proud and excited to be with you and be colleagues with you all in the work, and look forward to the continued battles that are to come. This has been the first of a series of BMI CUNY Dialogues. I am Dr. Mahaliel Bethea. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me.
Yeah, have a good one. Take care, yeah.